Our readings this weekend hit on a very important topic. I think it's important for us to spend some time on, and that is the vice of ambition. As Americans, we can find it extremely difficult to imagine how ambition can be anything but a really good thing and how it can be bad. But the scriptures, as we see today, the tradition, sees ambition as something for us to avoid, for us to be healed of. And so with that, a quick distinction that must be made, seeing the sickness, and then third, the medicine that needs to be applied. So the quick distinction, St. Thomas Aquinas, when he treats the vice of ambition, he treats it under the heading of magnanimity. Magnanimity is a virtue. It's a good thing. It literally means greatness of soul. Thomas Aquinas would say that, or says that one is magnanimous if they desire to do great things, strive for excellence and greatness. But vices come into play with virtues when you either have a lack of, also when there's an excess of. There can be vices on either side of those. So like with the virtue of magnanimity, the lack, when it's not there, is where a person shrinks away from greatness, right? And that's whether due to fear that they might have, a lack of confidence in their gifts, or maybe it's just flat out laziness. And so therefore, like I pull away. I'm pulling away from this desire from greatness. That's called the vice of pusillanimity, Aquinas says. But then you can have the excess, where the virtue of magnanimity isn't there, rather there's an extreme of it. And that is the person striving for greatness, but it's coming from the spot of the ego and pride, a desire to elevate the self above others, where you're seeking this recognition or status and power and honor. It's the vice of ambition. So ambition can be a good, healthy thing, but if it's in excess, it can become a vice. And I think with the age of social media that we're in, I think with the pressure within the suburbs and in the city, we're seeing the vice of ambition and the sickness that's caused from it. The sickness. Book of James puts it rather bluntly. We heard it in our second reading. The very first verse, we're in chapter 3, verse 16. He says, where selfish ambition exists, there is disorder and every kind of foul practice. Where there's the vice of ambition within the soul, there will be a trail eventually that leads to disorder. The soul will become disordered. Community will become disordered. Society, foul practice within the soul. I think we're seeing it. Not too long ago, there was a study that came out, a pretty extensive study that was done that named the top environmental conditions negatively impacting adolescent wellness. And you could put in adult wellness in there as well. But it says among the top environmental conditions that negatively impacting adolescent wellness, among the top, excessive pressure to excel. It went on to say, when there is extreme pressure to succeed or to outdo everyone else, often, it says, occurring in especially in affluent communities, it can affect youth in significantly harmful ways, including causing high levels of stress and anxiety, or alcohol and drug use and dependence. I don't think anybody would argue that we're seeing that disorder within the soul of our young people, and I think even above young with regards to maybe pressure to excel and achieve, the vice of ambition. In many ways, I think our culture kind of cultivates a vice of ambition. Again, we're not talking the good ambition, We're talking about the vice. I mentioned before this newish book by Jennifer Wallace entitled Never Enough. It quickly became one of the New York Times bestsellers, and it's subtitled When Achievement Culture Becomes Toxic. And the book is a result of her thousands of interviews that she did with parents and families and interviewing children and leading psychologists. And in the book, she puts it this way, after all of her interviews, she says, as parents, we sometimes think our role is to help fuel and support our kids' ambition. But in a hyper-competitive culture in which we find ourselves in, kids sometimes need the opposite. They need the adults in their lives to prevent them from sacrificing their minds and bodies on the altar of achievement, and to teach them how to build the kind of life they won't need substances to escape. One more, she says, what emerged from my research hit me like an ice bath. Our kids are absorbing the idea that their worth is contingent on their performance, their GPA, the number of social media followers they have, the college they get into, not for who they are deep at their core. They feel they only matter to the adults in their lives, their peers, the larger community, if they are successful. Ambition can be a good thing. Desire to be great, desire for our children to be great, good. But it's important for the motivation to be checked, for us to sit with and be brought to the Lord. Because oftentimes there's little corners in our hearts where there's a vice of ambition, and it needs to be purified. It's in me. There's corners in my heart where I notice this vice of ambition, desire for the status or to seen as greater and for honor. I think it causes, just as the scriptures say, and we see the disorder and foul practice within the soul, and then community, and then society. Luckily, with the sickness, there's a medicine. We see it rather quickly when Jesus sniffs it out. You have the disciples that are walking along the way. They get there. Jesus noticed that they were talking amongst each other and say, hey, what were you talking about? We were talking about who's the greatest among us. Jesus sniffs out the ego there. He sniffs out that there's some vice of ambition going on. And the very next thing he does is he takes a little child and places it in their midst. And he puts his arm around it. And Jesus uses children numerous times in the scriptures of, today he says, when you receive this child, you receive me. Other places he says, unless you become like this child, you can't inherit the kingdom of heaven. So a lot you could say about the qualities of a child that Jesus uses: their humility, their dependence. But I think the one element of a child in this context, especially when Jesus is kind of railing on the vice of ambition and the desire to be the greatest, there's one child or quality in a child that is increasingly on display for me. I think on Mondays when I go home and I'm with my twin sister's kids, my nephews, who's 4 years old right now, a 2-year-old, and a 7-month-old, there's a lot of crying, right? A lot of tears. And most of the tears, I'm convinced, in the 7-month-old, the 2-year-old, and the 4-year-old, the tears are their desire just to be loved. Whether it's they just got hit on the head, but they want to be known, they want to be loved, they want to be held. A child's ability to recognize their own desire to receive love and to be loved, and that it's not contingent on success or anything else. And I was at a conference a few months ago, and the speaker was saying that I think he's got 3 sons and a daughter, but he was saying how his son Micah Micah, out of all of his kids, he's the lovey-dovey one. He is extremely affectionate. Micah, he said, is the one who, when he leaves, right before he leaves for a business trip, Micah's the one who's the first to shed a tear. Micah's the one, as soon as he gets off the bus, Micah is the one who jumps into his father's arms. He says, yeah, my other children, they appreciate dad time, but Micah, more so than any of the other siblings, craves dad time. On Christmas morning, one Christmas morning, the father saw a note under the Christmas tree, and it was a little note in colored pencil or crayon, and it was from Micah, and the note just simply said, "Dad, I love you. Do you love me?" Question mark. And the dad was saying he knows that Micah didn't write that out of a spot of insecurity, wondering of whether or not he's loved or not. Like Micah was a boy who knew that dad loved him. But what he realized is Micah writing that under the Christmas tree, "Dad, I love you, do you love me?" was just Micah simply loving to hear it. Loving to hear his dad say it. Can you see that you and I are no different than Micah? That our deepest need is to hear the Father say, "I love you, daughter. I love you, son. I see you. I recognize you." You don't have to be the greatest. You don't have to be the greatest. Let me put my arms around you. See, that's what heals the vice of ambition. That most of us have little corners in our hearts that have it for recognition and status and honor. What those spots ultimately are is us making that move of, "Dad, I love you. Do you love me?" And so at this Mass, I'd encourage you to ask the same question Micah did. Whether it's after the homily, right now, or when you receive the Eucharist and head back to your pew, ask the same question Micah did. "Dad, I love you. Do you love me?" And soak up the answer, because that's the medicine. That's the medicine. That's what will heal us from disorder and every kind of foul practice that's in the soul caused by the vice of ambition.